So good Davach. As always, we'll start by thanking the Shul for hosting the series. Thank you. And the Lehman family, I think I see them here. This time we're being the series sponsor. So thank you for that. As you see tonight, the sponsor is Avi Glazer, the one who's out of town. I mean, out of his wife's birthday, he's living in Florida now. Don't you feel bad for him, We do have, by the way, one half lecture still unsponsored. It got messed up along the way. So if there's anybody who wants to be a good soul and step forward to take care of that, you'll let me know. I do want to, as always, thank our tech team who had to really hustle tonight to make things happen in a very efficient way. And I think without any further ado, we'll get down to business. I do have the Israel trip coming up, as you see over here. Let's go to the next one. Yeah. And we have about 2-3 spots, something like that, left, if anybody's interested in jumping in at the last minute. And I think it'll sell itself. And I do want to thank the tech team, and now we'll get down to actual work. We're doing the winter lecture series of 2022 to 2023. It's already December. The title of the series is Oslo, Immigration Assassination, the State of Israel and the Jewish People, 1992 to 96. Tonight is number 7 out of 13, I think. 7th lecture, which is a startup nation, the Israeli economy in 1992 to 96. So tonight we have to talk about the dismal science, but by someone who's not an economist, so maybe it'll be less boring. Not as accurate, but less boring. I know some home truths, and so do you. As we know, the state of Israel for many years had, and to a certain degree continues to have, a screwball economy and economic policy, because Israel is not a typical country. Consider the following. Israel now since 1948 is a permanent state of war. I don't know any countries like that are in a permanent state of war. So just think of what that means economically. Second of all, Israel has, since 1948, been subject of an Arab boycott, which screws up your economics, because ordinarily you trade with countries that are near you. That's not the only ones you trade with, but at the most basic level, the United States and Canada, the United States and Mexico, I mean, then NAFTA and everything else, that's usually where most of your trade goes. Let's pretend for a minute, just for argument's sake, that there was no Arab boycott of Israel. And Israel could import and export, let's say food or whatever it is from the Arab countries, and export high tech all over the Middle East. We make a fortune because they're 100 miles ahead of everybody else. And the Middle Eastern countries, instead of having to go far away, for the high tech, you have right next door, you see? But it's never been like that. So that's another factor. So when you calculate economics, you have to take all this into account. Israel has, by circumstances, as we all know, been compelled, ever since 1948, to have a military which is way out of proportion for a country of 7 million, right? Ordinarily, a country the size of Israel doesn't need that cutting-edge, fancy schmancy, very expensive kind of military that they have. We have no choice, okay? Again, had there been peace in the Middle East, all that money down the decades would have gone for domestic spending, right? In a smart world, we're going for R&D. But, we need the best Air Force. Costs a lot of money. You need the best spy stuff. It costs a lot of money. It's what it is. So again, it's not it's not like my household economy and yours. Israel, as we all know, has been blessed or cursed since 1948 with borders which are a nightmare and require a lot of money. Think of the old Green Line borders, with the West Bank and all the rest of it, and think of the borders even what you have today, after the Oslo agreements, all the rest of it, and think of the Gaza Strip and all this other kind of business. It costs a fortune, right? I mean, it's not, like I said before, it's not the border between Wisconsin and Iowa, It's the border. If you don't guard it 24/7, literally, with all the most high-tech stuff, they'll cross over and do bad stuff. Even as it is, nothing's perfect. But imagine if it was different. So all this costs a fortune, which, for example, a regular country, I don't know, Brazil or something like that, doesn't have to pay for that kind of stuff, all right? Then, as we all know, Israel has been required, certainly since the 80s, I guess, to do expensive asymmetrical warfare expenses. Okay, so it's no longer just a business. They do something to you, you bomb them or whatever. As we've seen, all this counterterrorism infrastructure and all this business of espionage and all this business of training special units, I don't know what they're called, to go in against these other guys, against the bad guys, it costs a lot of money. Okay, so these again are not the expenses that a typical country has to go through. I think that Israel probably has an unusually large police force because they need it. In fact, it's probably not big enough. And again, that's way beyond. Most places in America have small police forces compared to what they need. Baltimore sure does, okay? And in Israel, you simply cannot afford it. I'm not saying things are perfect with the Mishnah as it is, but imagine if it was smaller numbers like you have in a country like, I don't know, Germany or Switzerland or something like that. You just have to pay that money, okay? Israel, once again, as we know, has no natural resources, not really, okay? Only recently they discovered that gas business and all that, and who knows how it's going to go. But that's very recently. So again, you're talking about a situation in which you're trying to build an economy with many curses and very few blessings. Let's put it that way. Right? And it's also true, ever since 1948 or those early years, Israel has been committed, as have all modern Western states, to a social welfare state. Okay? That means that, it's not like America in 1922. In this country, if it was 100 years ago, which was under Harding and Coolidge, there was no Social Security, there was no unemployment insurance, there was no welfare, it was all local, you know what I mean? Federal government didn't spend that kind of stuff. And if you were in trouble, tough luck on you. What did it mean in 1922 for a senior citizen to need an operation? It wasn't going to happen most of the time. I reminded myself, I remember, I won't go into names, a certain rabbi was a very close friend of my father. He needed an operation in the 1950s, and they couldn't do it. And I think it was the Chizuk Amunah raised their money because they liked him for a certain reason, and to pay for the operation. This is what life was like. Now, Israel had been committed, for better or worse, with all the plus and minuses, to a social welfare state, which is very expensive. That's my point. What is eating up most of our budget in America, is your defense and your social services, okay? So Israel's had that. In addition, certainly in the last several decades, they spent a lot of money subsidizing, I'll use a general term, subsidizing the Haredim. Now, there's a lot of money that goes to the yeshivas and other things like this, which again, other countries like this one doesn't do. So all these are I don't want to use the word off the books, but not typical type of economic expenditures, okay? Then, of course, in addition to everything I just said, Israel's had to come up with the money for Aliyah, Klita, things like this. Think of the Ethiopians, for example, and whatever. These are expensive propositions. I mean, if you remember, we did last year. The guy flew into Addis Ababa and gave the head guy a valise, with like $50 million in 20s, right? So this is part of life over there. In addition to that, if you're looking from an economic point of view, Israel spent a fortune subsidizing the settlements in the occupied territories and their infrastructures. Every one of the yeshuvim, and I plan to go to a few of them in January, let's say, for example, in Shomron, as well as I know, they can't be there without the army providing the bitachon that's necessary, and it costs a lot of money, okay? Again, think of Hebron. How long would those guys be there if you pulled out the army? You get it? So we do it, but all these hit the pocketbook very heavily. And so Israel does not have, as I say before, a regular economy. In addition to that, so I've already piled up a lot of expenses. In addition to that, Israel has administered the occupied territories for about 50 to 70 years now. That's a long time. Now here there were interesting developments. By the way, look at this. Under Israeli military occupation since the Six-Day War, the Palestinian economy, in other words, these are Palestinians now, developed rapidly, real per capita national income grew at 20% in 69-72. Just think about that. Notice the per capita income, notice what the average person made jumped up 20%. I'll tell you why. Did you ever go shopping in the shuk? Remember, once upon a time, there was enormous tourism. There isn't today, but there was enormous tourism once upon a time, and it was good for the Arabs, you see? And it grew at 5% after the Yom Kippur War. So it means even after that, there was still a fair amount of this. 5% growth in income is also not a Kleinigkeit, right? But it fluctuated wildly thereafter and decreased in times of hostilities. Palestinian per capita income equaled 10% of the Israeli income in 68, but it doubled in less than 20 years. In less than 20 years. But then look at this. Then it went down in 98. Now, why did it go in 98? Who's going shopping at the Arab Shuk today? Raise your hand if you want to go on a shopping expedition to Nablus. You understand? Which Israelis, by the way, used to do all the time, okay? Especially the non-frum used to go all the time. I hate to say it, but these guys made a fortune on Pesach time. It was notorious. You get it? Made a fortune on Pesach time. Now, obviously, they don't care. They cut the nose despite the face, whatever the expression is. But if you're talking about from the pocketbook point of view, you don't see people, go spending money in the shuk. Not Yerushalayim and across the board. But nevertheless, Israel had to spend, and did spend a lot of money in terms of the administration costs of running these places. And to use modern terminology, as you know very well, Israel does give the PA a certain amount of money every year, what they take in the taxes and things like that. So the Intifada, basically, starting in the 80s, and then the second one for sure, and afterwards, definitely hurt them in their pocketbook, okay? Now, the founders of Israel, as we know, the founders of Israel were caught up in the romance of mid-20th century socialism, just like all the other new states. Here we are in the year 2022. So this gives us a certain perspective on the 20th century, which is now ancient history, okay? And you can view the 20th century in many ways. One of the ways, not the only, one of the ways of looking at the 20th century you call the rise and fall of the romance of socialism and communism. There was a time, and maybe your parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts were all caught up in this. There was a time when people thought you can solve the problems of the world through some form of Marxism or another, either socialist or communist or this and the other. And and I know people really believed in this, and I would even say believed in it for the best of reasons. They wanted a society which was just, in which there was a normal distribution of income, and all that sort of thing. And they looked down, tremendously on regular capitalism. I mean, I think it was a dirty word to say in 1950 you're a capitalist. The most thing, even Wall Street invented a new word, free enterprise. You see, that way took the edge off. But that's gone because the socialism didn't work simply because not enough money to pay for it. And what's happened is, and someone may possibly write this one day, socialism killed Europe because they had to bring in all these non-European workers to do the industries that provided the capital to pay for the socialist payments, benefits, and meanwhile they lost their country. You understand? It's funny how this goes. But it doesn't matter. If you want to know what the mentality of any normal, nice person was in the middle of the 20th century, you're going to be a socialist of one form or another. Even in this country, you couldn't say the word socialist perhaps, but a democratic liberal was boiled down to that. LBJ was pretty much a socialist, that kind of thing. I'm free. I mean in a good way. They wanted to, solve the problems of society, and you could do it through proper government action. Now, therefore, socialism is a wide variety term. It means this here, it means that there. But if you're talking about the state of Israel, Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, all those types of people, their socialism, when Israel was founded, consisted, number one, of social welfare supported by heavy taxation. So the idea was, all these refugees are coming now. Israel will provide them with houses, will provide them with jobs, hopefully, with food, medical care, all that sort of thing, education. Now, they didn't always do that, but that was a basic goal, right? And that's what they consider to be a civilized country. They didn't simply say, you land over here, get your own job, you're on your own, tough luck, and so forth. So social welfare was a very important point. I remember there was an interview with Golda Meir. Said, what do you mean by socialism? She basically said, well, social welfare. She wasn't talking Marxist theory or something like that. She said that people should have what we call in this country today a safety net. That's what she meant. The other half of Israeli socialism, this is, again, the Ben-Gurion Mapai period, was statism, which means the statists control the economy, right? The state should control the economy, which is very much a very basic socialist notion in the mid-20th century. It's, as you know, the official notion of the Soviet Union, which they interpreted so rigidly it took them down. Okay, nobody could have a job. Everything had to be by the government. And China, it's funny, isn't it? They're always shifting back and forth on this sort of thing. But statism is what you call it, in which the state controls the economy. Why? For two purposes, one good and one bad. The good purpose is that the state makes sure that all the money is channeled to vital infrastructure and not to consumer spending. So let's say, for example, you raise $100 million, I'm just making it up, raise $100 million in taxes, for argument's sake. What do you do with the $100 million? So in America, Bush said, give it back to the taxpayer, Well, what do? They'll blow in Vegas, you see? No, we have to take $30 million and build a harbor in Tel Aviv or something like that, and a highway over here, and we have to build schools there, and we have to build hospitals here. In other words, there's basic infrastructure in the society, and only the state will make the right decisions, because the private will only do for the private. You understand? The factory will only do for themselves. So that's the positive reason for statism. And when it worked in the middle of the 20th century, it worked a little bit. And France, for example, worked very well for a while. So you could take, so to speak, the excess money that's out there in the economy, and you won't go on a trip to Israel, but instead the government will make a new road, somewhere in Baltimore that'll be good for the people. That's one way. And number two, and may I say that under this system, how does that work in practice? I'll tell you what I mean by that. How does that work in real world? You say, well, the state's going to build a road. The state's not going to build a road. The state's going to give it out to a contractor. Do you get what I'm saying? He's going to give it to somebody with a company. There's the problem. Who are they going to give it to? One of their guys who's got their company. You get it? Notice, this is where the idol has clay feet. You get it? Where the company. Because at the end of the day, it was not the Soviet model. People saw that's too rigid. In the Soviet model, nobody has a factory. The government owns all the factories. The government, somebody to run the factory and all the rest of it. And the result is, if it rains, the worker doesn't care. Let the tractor get rusty. It's not his money. You understand? And so what they end up doing is this socialist business in which, like I said before, if we have a $5 million contract to something up, I'm going to pick you. Why am I going to pick you? For purely objective reasons. In other words, you're my brother-in-law, This is how it goes. Or somebody's son-in-law, or something like this. A little bit like the world of the day schools, the yeshivas today. Not in Baltimore, but everywhere else. Now, hold on for a second. As a result, in Lamaisa terms, economically in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it was the state which gave the seed money to chosen industrialists, usually with the idea of decreasing unemployment. So the man who ran the economy for 30 years was Pinchas Sapir, right? Looks a little bit like my father. He says, and he was the guy in charge of the economy. And by the way, he himself made no money. He wasn't that type. He was a real socialist. He lived a modest thing. But he basically says, I created 100 millionaires or 1,000 millionaires, something like that. Because now the guy on the right, this fat fellow, it used to be the head of the Aguda in the parliament for a while, Munyan Shapiro. But before that, wait a minute. Before that, he was a Hasidic guy who moved from Poland to Israel. I forget exactly when. His family had some experience running carpet factory in Poland. And so Pinchas Sapir gave him, I don't know, $5 million, whatever it is, start your own business, because then you'll create an Israeli industry, and meanwhile you employ workers. That's why he said like this, Lilo chashuv shtachim, li chashuv shtichim. That's famous, All I care about is the carpets. That's one example. Now, it didn't matter that he was a chassid. It was that Pinchas appears like this. He comes from a family that has a business experience. Chances are they'll know how to run the place. And, for 20, 30 years, now they're broke. But, for 20, 30 years, they ran and they employed all these people and they made the carpets. But as happens with all these government subsidized industries, they become inefficient and then they go under. You get it? No, you don't have the discipline of the marketplace. There's no Adam Smith involved over here. So this is, by the way, this is not only in Israel, happened in dozens of countries. Sometimes it succeeded, usually it failed. One country where it succeeded is South Korea. They did the exact same thing, but then these guys are real go-getters, and when the government stopped giving them the subsidies, they ran with the companies anywhere. Taiwan also is another example. So Asia is associated with this. Israel was kacha, because a lot of these industries went under, but some didn't, like that. That is what they called the old statist economy. If the enterprises employ many persons, then they're too big to fail. So if a guy like Shapiro said, I guess, I can't meet my payments this year and all that, I'm going to have to lay off 1,000 workers. Comes, oh, no, we'll give you the subsidy. We'll make it up. So what does that mean? You screw up, but don't worry, somebody else is paying for it. It's like a son-in-law, So what was the result? Okay, the state subsidizes poorly run enterprises. Now, the really bad side is, of course, that statist control of the economy means you have a political tool to stay in office through the old boy networks. Okay, protects you. It's the foundation of institutionalized protects you. Because if you play ball with the right guys, you'll be able to get, the seed money to start an enterprise, and otherwise, how are you supposed to do it? You say, well, I go and get private investors. Very little of that if the state is running the whole economy, you see? And so the result is they had this kind of economy, and by the way, that is why the Israeli economy came to be hated by the Sephardim, because they weren't at the right place in the old boy network, and they weren't the ones generally who got these kind of contracts. And even though theoretically it's all socialist, it's for the general good, all the rest of it. But I told you, when it goes down Lamaisa, comes down to the bottom line, when rubber hits the road, it's not, you see? Now, see, economics and cultural politics were hopelessly entangled in Israel. It's not the only country. I would say, to a significant degree, in the United States of America today, you could also say economics and cultural politics are hopelessly entangled. That's a fact. Now, the problem with statism, of course, is that you have heavy-handed rigidity. It discourages out-of-the-box thinking, which we all call innovation. And innovation is the lifeblood of a high-tech economy. Statism is the opposite of small, lean, and mean. You don't want small companies that, make it through a Darwinian process. You want large companies that employ lots of people. Now, I can't emphasize again and again, this was very common across the world. I mean, New Zealand, for example, pops to mind. The goal of the economic planners was to maximize employment, okay? Employment sometimes is the enemy of innovation. That makes sense, correct? You're employing 50 people to do a job. Now, I just made a machine that can do the job that 50 people did. So what do? Right? This is as old as time. Believe it or not, if you look at Suetonius, I remember this, the Emperor Vespasian had some public works project to dig a canal near Rome or something like this, and a Greek engineer came up with a thing they could do by machine. And Vespasian had him killed, right? Because he said, I got to put all these people to work. Guys like you make trouble for me. Okay, if that's how you want to go, you're not going to definitely succeed in an international economic environment, you see? So this is how things went. Louis Brandeis is the famous exponent of the fact that large businesses, large corporations, are terrible because they discourage innovation. They're too rigid. They have no flexibility. His whole economic program, if you know anything at all about American history, not that you should, then you'll know that Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1913 on Brandeis's program. Brandeis wrote it all up for him. And it was called the New Democracy. And the idea was take all these big industries which were growing in America at that time, Carnegie, Rockefeller, all this kind of stuff, and break them up into small things because they'll be better. You see, it'd be better. Now, Brandeis happened to be the leading Zionist, but they never listened to him on economic policy. This fundamentally unhealthy economic situation was modified, maybe hidden might be the right word, by a colonialist economic policy towards the Shtachim, which is kind of interesting. In other words, in these years, as you know and I know, for close to 30 years, from 67 to 94, Israel controlled the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, correct? Right? And that means when they controlled it, they controlled the economy. And that means, let's say, for example, you produce a radio. You have a company that makes radios. Maybe the Japanese radios are better than yours. But you're in Israel, you have a radio shop in Netanya. It was under Moshe Dayan and all the rest of it. That's the radios they're selling in the stores in the Shtachim. It's called colonialist economics. In this country, we had this called the American Revolution, you may perhaps recall. Right? There was a time in this country where you're not allowed to make a hat. I could get the fur, I could send the fur to London. London, they make the hat, then they ship it back over here, and they would sell it. Right? It's a colonialism. So in Israel, you had this funny economy that I just described, but to a certain degree it was masked because even economically inefficient enterprises could sell their stuff in the to quote unquote a captive population. You understand? And that way, I have quote unquote artificial profits. You see? So this is what happened. Even today, by the way, I mean I don't go typically to Annapolis, but there, a lot of stores still have Israeli products because now it's cheaper. It's next door, and this is how it goes. Now, this masked Israel's basic problem of a socialized economy because, look, maybe we can't market our product in the international market, but we can market it in the Shtachim. So why can't you market in the international market? We don't have enough innovation, all the rest. Why don't have enough innovation? I don't want to fire my brother-in-law. You get it? But it doesn't matter because we'll always have a market we can sell this stuff to. Okay. Now, then, to complicate things more, as we know in this series, it came the Menachem Begin mess, okay? Because Menachem Begin, as we know, I'm sorry to say, ran macroeconomic policy based on sentiment, which is a recipe for disaster, as we know in the United States of America, correct? Israel hit the Argentine inflation of hundreds of inflation. Why? Because Begin's like this, you got to give the poor this, you got to give this one this, you can't be without this, they have to give this, all of which, by the way, were good causes. You understand? They were good causes, but it's not enough money. And so what do? You print more money. So that messed everything up. And the mess, as we know, did not stop until Shimon Peres came aboard in the mid-1980s, because Shimon Peres, for the short time that he was the prime minister, he was also finance minister, whatever, he put the macroeconomic policy decisions in the hands of the experts, the economic, monetary, and fiscal experts of the Misrad HaOtzar of Israel's Treasury Department. Those people actually know how to do this sort of thing, because running economics is not identical as running tzedakah. In an ideal world, it would be, but it's not. And I'll tell you again, what is the reason the United States has over 30 trillion, I repeat, over 30 trillion, like 31, 32 now, in the national debt? And raise your hands if you think they're ever going to pay off 30 trillion. Yeah, I mean, how are you going to do that? You understand? One day they'll declare Chapter 11. That's the end of it. There's no other way. Excuse me. So, in addition to all the funny aspects of the Israeli economy built in, you had this roller coaster business when Begin and Shamir and the others were there in the 70s, 80s. Take a look at this. Let's see. Yeah. You can see the numbers of the inflation. So just notice, this is right after the Six-Day War was 2%, then it jumped to 6%, inflation. Then it jumped to double digit, okay? But wait a minute, triple digit. Look at that. Oh my goodness, 300, look at that, 373% inflation. That's what they call Argentinian inflation. This was under Likud, you understand? Because in addition to not saying no to everybody, they also had a war. You remember the Lebanon war. These are crazy numbers, all right? These are crazy numbers. Now, look at this. This is when Paris came in. So they knocked it from 300% to 47%, and then down to around 20% or less. So in this country, we go crazy if we had double-digit inflation, right? What do we have now? Yeah, it's getting up there, right? It's getting up there, and people are really nervous. In those years, they would kill for 8%. You understand? So this, again, is going to affect, obviously, the economy and all the rest of it. Because how can you have a regularly running economy where, you remember in Israel, every day you had to spend all your money because tomorrow's going to be less? Remember that? Even with the indexing. People say like this, what's the point of savings, if it's going to be like that? So it was an inflation monster. So basically, Paris and company cut the inflation rate, as you see over here, from 3 digits to 2, which is amazing, okay? You got to give them credit. Actually, it's under 20%. Maybe if you look at the later years after the mid-'80s. 20% is not great, but it was gewaldic compared to 300%, okay? Now, so when Yitzhak Rabin came in, and that's what we're doing this year, the inflation was around 12%. Let's look at these numbers, okay? This is the Rabin years. So again, it's not what you want, but it's, for double digits, very, very low. It's 10, 12. You see what I'm saying? It's not great, but it was great compared to what had been a few years beforehand. That's my point. So this is the economy that Rabin came in here. Basically, what happened was they applied budget restraint. They couldn't do bleeding heart stuff, welfare, even though there were many schemes, and well-meaning ones on the part of the left-wing parties like Meretz and the others. There were, to subsidize this and provide relief for that and all the rest of it. And there are poor people in Israel, my goodness, okay? There is a crying need. Don't make the mistake of thinking just because you see a couple guys making zillions that there aren't a ton of people that have trouble, getting meals, okay? But the treasury guy said like this, well then come up with the way with the money. Don't use the existing money or create inflation funding money, right? Now Rabin was a general, but he respected the economic experts and the monetary experts, so there was no printing of money. They didn't go that route. On the other hand, he had a big expense out of nowhere, which is the Russian Aliyah. Now, on the one hand, you love it. On the other hand, from the point of view of the Misrata Otzer, from the Treasury Department, in the short term, that's a bummer because the expenses are huge, correct? And I'm not even saying they did a great job, but whatever it is, just to provide housing and food and this and that and the other, basic stuff for what amounted to 1 million people, just about 1 million people. Think of, for a country the size of Israel, think about what that means, okay? Now again, it's like a mixed blessing. It's like if you get caught in Israel in the winter on the road in a heavy rain. You can't curse the rain. In Israel, you can't curse the rain. On the other hand, you say, I guess, I had to be here at this particular time. So it was a complicated situation. You had the Aliyah from Russia coming in. On the other hand, in the plus side of the economics, there was a lot of negotiations, as we've seen. There wasn't talk of war in 1992, 1996. As I told you, they were actually conducting secret negotiations with Assad and Saddam Hussein. So what that means is there wasn't the saber rattling that you often come across. Now, we forget this. We lived through it, but we had lives, so we didn't pay attention to this. But there wasn't the kind of business that there's going to be a war possibly in a few weeks because heavy negotiations were going on behind the scenes, okay? And that means Israel had peace, as far as war and peace is concerned, not to terrorism, but as far as regular state-to-state relations concerned. And Israel had a big boost, as I told you, because the Iron Curtain collapsed. As I mentioned, all of a sudden, in the early 90s, this is Rabin, Israel's friends with Czechoslovakia, with Poland, with Romania, not Romania, but with Bulgaria and Hungary, Lithuania, Latvia, these are countries. And they do need stuff. And therefore, you can open fruitful trade with all these kind of countries that never existed before. So you see how it's so funny? You're sitting there in the economic control headquarters in Tel Aviv, and you say, well, this is the minus, but this is the plus. You see? This is costing us like crazy, but here's new sources of revenue coming in because we never really had any trade with Poland. And now we're having a lot. We never had much trade with Czechoslovakia or or Estonia or something like this, and now they started to. So that's one of the things that kind of balanced it. The Oslo Accords, the whole phenomenon, made it look to many people, especially abroad, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. If you remember, either you were the type that was scared out of your mind that Rabin is giving away the store, those are the people who killed him, or you're the other side. You say, "Oh, peace is at hand," like John Lennon or something like that, And wait a second. So Israel's a good place to invest. Is it going to be a safe country? They have a good workforce? They have educated people over there. Investment is the lifeblood of an economy. Israel, prior to this, had investment, but not in big numbers. Starting around now, starts to build up what is today huge investment. Okay, today's huge investment. That's what's and every country in the world is like that. Correct? I mean, the United States gets a lot of investment, makes us nervous from the Japanese, the Chinese, and this, that, and the other. But the money's coming in. You get a country that gets no investment, that's called Syria. You see? For all I know, it's probably Iran or something like this, where the economic rate is negative. You understand? Because raise your hand if you think it's a good idea to invest in soda machines in Beirut or something like that. It's not a good idea. So I'm trying to convey to you the complexity of the situation. Now, mind you, the socialist model had always been, as I said before, about keeping unemployment down. That's what we call Keynesian economics, John Maynard Keynes. Right? He's the one who came up with the idea that you should have government work projects during depressions and things like this, because in England, especially in their culture, high unemployment was really a scary phenomenon. And you don't know this probably, but when the Great Depression hit, the country that provided employment more quickly than was Great Britain. They said, we'll do whatever we need to keep the unemployment numbers down. They can't provide for everybody, of course, but they didn't have the huge unemployment like it had in the United States and places like that. I'm trying to say economics is a science, but it's a funny kind of a science. And I'm not an economist. It's a humanistic science. Economics is about what people will do under different circumstances. That's why economic history is very interesting. You get it? What will people do under certain circumstances? And a lot of times the rules don't necessarily match the experience, and then you have to modify your economic policies. I'll give you the best example that comes to my mind. Drive down Reisterstown Road. Here it's 319, and here it's 317. You don't see all the cars, abandoning 319 and going 317. Half of them go here, half of them go here. Do you notice that? Theoretically, supply and demand should mean that this guy should go broke and this guy should get all the customers, right? Nobody should be buying gas at the Shell station over here, and what do you call? And yet they do. I won't say raise your hand, but you do. You understand? How many people are going to go downtown to save 10 cents? Not so. I've seen a few of you. No, but you see what I'm saying? You can't simply say supply and demand. There's other factors that go into it. That's my point. So Keynes was all about keeping down the unemployment. Now, and this became the model for all countries. Okay, it's about keeping down the unemployment. As you know, Hitler came about because of unemployment. If Germany would have been prosperous, he would not have come to power. Remember, there was a 28 election, the 30 election, the 32 election in Germany. In the 28 election, he got slaughtered. In 30, he bounced back because of the heavy depression. In 32, he bounced back not as much, but still heavy. But in good times, he wouldn't have come to power. That's today's parsha, if you want to divide Torah. Esav says, Yesh li rov. Achi, yehi lecha shelach. Right? How come Esav didn't kill Yaakov? Esav was doing fine. You see, he was doing fine. That's the meaning of that. The whole a dream or attractiveness of communism used to be zero unemployment. This was Lenin and Stalin. Why do so many Jews and others think, they're like gods and communism is the perfect thing? Because in Russia, kein Arbeitslosigkeit. There's no unemployment. I was in Soviet Russia, and these two guys came over, two old communist Jews, at the exhibit I was at, and says, what's the Arbeitslosigkeit in America, or something like this. And I did said to myself, the Jews all have jobs. Oh, okay, good. Yes, you know. They, I can't overemphasize this. Now, today things are different, but I'm talking about at that time. It's hard for us today, me sitting here, to express this idea of the terrors of unemployment in the corona and post-corona environment. Now we know in America and everywhere else, people just not going to work. Isn't that what you hear all the time? I think if you go to every store, what's the sign you see? Help wanted, right? Theoretically, that should have been great for the employment, right? Let me put it this way. Anybody who wants a job, now I'm not saying that job, but anybody who wants a job will get one now. And nobody wants the job. You see? So it's a funny thing. We never heard of giveaways like we went through last year. One day, somebody will be doing the 2020s, and they'll say, oh, long ago was a corona, and this, that, and the other. Now, it's hard to do this. What was the story of unemployment under Rabin? He gave me this chart. It went down. Okay? It went down. So the economy, even though they were taking in the Ruskies, nevertheless, the unemployment went down. So you see, it was expanding. New businesses and things were happening. That's interesting. Now, 8 is not perfect, but 8 is normal. Okay? In a regular industrial economy, it's a little high. But 8, 5, 6, 7, 8 is kind of normal. 4 means there's no unemployment out there. Okay? Now, the trick is, how do you do low inflation and low unemployment? All countries wrestle with that. Okay? Because usually, especially on the Keynesians, so if you lower the inflation, you're going to raise lower the unemployment, you're going to raise the inflation. How do you do that? The Mapai and the left in Israel tried to juggle the ball in the old days, and under statism, it was possible. In the Ben-Gurion era, you could have a relatively low inflation, a relatively low unemployment, if the public accepted a low standard of living, as they used to call it, the margarine instead of butter. In the 50s, there was no butter in Israel. It was all margarine. And that's it. You understand? And, chatzilim, and tough luck. And everybody was in the same boat. As long as the public buys that, okay, more or less, even if there's a little cheating on the side, as long as everybody says, every day you're going to have bread and butter, which was cheap, and milk, what was it, 3, 4 cents, things like that. That was subsidized. The basics, which I remember it was very cheap. As long as that, you can supply a family on bread and butter and a few things like that, and eggs. You don't have to go to Serengeti's every day. You understand? Okay. But after the 6-Day War, and especially after 1977, consumerism hit Israel big time. And Menachem Begin was matir the color televisions, if you remember, okay? There was a time, so much of this is cultural. In the 60s, to say you wanted color TV in Israel was a sin. I don't know why, to this day exactly. They thought it was like something unbelievably decadent. You get it? It's something unbelievably decadent. Had to go with the culture, which, by the way, was an old fuddy-duddy attitude. The young people want color TV. That's my point. This attitude was a socialist, mid-1920s, certain people grew up in a certain way, not their kids, and certainly not their grandchildren, right? Now, the consumerism complicated statism. It caused a rise in taxes, already heavy, because how are you going to do all your social stuff and still allow people to take the money they're making and spend it on consumerist items, like I say, God forbid, a foreign TV or something like that. Now, the later Labor Party people, like Rabin in Paris, grew up in a culture of Mapai statist socialism, as they just said. They viewed it as a superior form of economic organization of society. This is the real reason why American Jews used to visit Israel but never settled there, right, in those years. Hey, go there, and to spend their money there, they said, but I ain't living like this. Right? That's the dirty truth, okay? I'm talking about the 50s, the 60s, and all that sort of thing. They're not going to live like this because they were already in America and the West and England, and their consumerism was a full stride. So everybody was too polite to say that, but that's what was going on, okay? Now, and we all remember, you have Israeli relatives come to America and say, oh, you live like Rockefeller. It's like even though all you had was one car. Understand, it wasn't even a new car. So, But they didn't see it that way. They thought that their culture is superior. They were not comfortable with a truly open, the Israeli founders were not comfortable with a truly open free market economy. They really despised the Adam Smith naked pursuit of wealth, which they thought was obscene. Now, I'm going to show you something I just found the other day, is Golda Meir, who's from that era, okay? And she ran Israel for 5 years. And apparently, I just saw this online. She did some kind of in her old age, I think the year she died, she did a TV interview. Listen to this. And then the interview was over, but the camera was still running. You get it? Hold on. And she says, okay, now I can smoke, and now the camera's not running. And then they ask you, what do you really think of the younger generation, this, that, and the other? And you'll see, she'll say, oh, the country, the young generation is decadent. And kesef hu erech? He said, when did kesef become an erech? When did money become a value? You see? You need money to pay your expenses. So in other words, she disdains and despises what everybody in this room is, okay? Which is, you want to make a living, you want to live a decent lifestyle. You follow? But it was a different mentality over here. Let's see if this works.
The American pressure and growing domestic criticism, Golda backs down from her demand for direct peace talks, signs the ceasefire agreement, and ends the war with Egypt for the time being.
She doesn't know the camera's on.
מה היחס שלך, גברת מאיר, לארצות הברית?
זו מדינה גדולה, יש בה הכל, מהנשגב ביותר עד שפל המדרגה. הכל. אני אהבתי מאוד את ניו יורק. אף פעם לא חייתי שם הרבה זמן, איזה חצי שנה לפני עלייתי. אבל אהבתי את ניו יורק. אבל זה ניו יורק עכשיו גם כן לא מה שהיה.
מדוע אין עלייה לארץ? מדוע העלייה היא לא גוברת, לפי דעתך?
זה האסון.
מה הסיבה?
זה האסון. בעצם, זה היות עוד לא לשידור. אולי מישהו יכול להסביר לי מדוע יהודים בארגנטינה
לא באים.
ממשיכים לשבת? ואני כמה פעמים דיברתי עם חבריי שם. אתם יודעים שאתם יושבים על הר געש. כן. נו. את מבינה, קשה לחסל. אני אמרתי לפני שנים עוד ליהודי דרום אפריקה. אתם לא מבינים, מוכרחה לבוא שעה של התנגשות בין שחורים ולבנים. בעיני השחורים אתם לבנים, בעיני לבנים אתם יהודים.
אולי משהו פגום בחברה שלנו?
לב שלי לא מתפוצץ עם לב של כל איש במדינה הזאת על מה שנעשה אצלנו. כאשר אני יודעת שיש אמהות שאומרות לבנות שלהם, חיילות ולא חיילות, שלא תעיזי לנסוע בטרמפ, העליתי פעם על דעתי שלזה נגיע.
מה גרם לזה לדעתך? איך הגענו לזה?
אני שואלת אותך, איך הגענו לזה? איך הגענו לזה? איך הגענו לזה שכסף נהפך לדבר כל כך ערך? מילא כסף, אני יודעת, קשה לחיות בלי כסף. ותאמתי איתם בחיי, כמה זה קשה לחיות בלי כסף. אבל זה ערך?
הכל היה אצלה הכרעה אידאית, הכרעה רעיונית. היא קיבלה את האידיאולוגיה הציונית-סוציאליסטית עוד בארצות הברית. הייתה נשואה
Yeah, so you get the idea, right? So she was from the true believers, but most Israelis in her time, so the young ones, they don't want to hear that. You understand? Because they say, you're in the government, you have a nice house, which she did, and you're this and that, and you're preaching to others. So it's your mentality, that's what makes history so interesting, It's not the laws of science, it's how people react. And here we see the generation gap. Now, looking back, as I said before, in the old 20th century, socialism is an ideal system of government ownership of private enterprise, and enlightened control of the nation's economy ran out of steam. That's what happened in the late 20th century. By the late century, economies that wanted to pull themselves out of the doldrums of stagflation went back to capitalism. That was Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and those types. You call it different names, neoliberalism, whatever it is, but that's what it boiled down to. Now, not totally, they didn't go back, let's go to the next one. They didn't go back to Ayn Rand and say, nobody gets anything, and, you starve or work on your own, but they went to Adam Smith. Adam Smith actually, if you know, was a moral person, and he believed the government should supply the basics, okay? But on the other hand, the government should not get in the way of the Yetzer Hara, right? Because the Yetzer Hara is what's going to make the economy move. If I'm not going to make money at it, why am I going to do it? You understand? That's the hidden hand, So that's what they wanted to go back to. And indeed, what were the markers of this in the late 70s, early 80s? Ronald Reagan broke the traffic controllers union. Remember that? He fired him. Okay, is anybody old enough to remember that? Right? And that's sending a message. And Margaret Thatcher broke the coal miners union. These people used to dominate the government. Okay? Now, at the same time, so in other words, you already had the rise of new capitalism, whatever you want to call it, by the 80s. And that's when Gorbachev ran out of steam and the communist economies mamish collapsed, as we know, not by outside attacks, but by inside collapse of socialism. This is why they couldn't pay the bills, okay? So deregulation, privatizing were the order of the day in the West. Now, consider, for example, the 30s and the 70s. Half of the New Deal of Roosevelt was regulation. They invented all these regulatory agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the CCC, the FAA, all the things to regulate the airwaves and the economy and, everything you can think of, okay? And I think it's a good idea. AAA, the air flights, things like this. Somebody should be in charge of that. And now you go to the 70s, 80s, is deregulation. Remember Carter put in the deregulation of airlines. So it was a while you could fly to Chicago for $10. Remember that? You have the deregulation. And so this is the general trend that's going on around the world. Not dismantling the welfare state, but ginning up to producing elements in order to generate the money that would pay for the social programs, okay? But old habits die hard. The Likud under Begin was committed to sort of a capitalism, but they did not really privatize and they did not deregulate. And neither would the labor government of Rabin. And yet, in spite of that, again, the Rabin government didn't really deregulate. So you still had this business where if I want to go to Israel, start a business, you still have all that government red tape junk in the way. And yet, in spite of this, a new sort of economy was forming in the 90s, which you and I call the dot-com revolution, okay? The money is not in the old heavy industries, but in the computer revolutions in information service. So here, what's the main asset? Is brains. You see? All of a sudden, you move to a situation, you can't have an industry in Israel if it has a lot of coal. Can't have an industry in Israel successful in the international market if it requires a lot of steel or a lot of oil. What if it requires a lot of brains? That's a different story. That's a different story, okay? Now, here comes the interesting part, at least to me. There was no major transformation in Israeli society in terms of providing a large labor force with the math and science skills to participate in the new globalized economy of increased trading between countries around the world, because you had the global economy emerging. The Israeli educational system is still flawed in 2022. I mean, generally speaking, the Israeli public schools, they have the same problems that we have in this country. Not as much, but it's far from great, okay? And you can look how the Israeli educational institutions are ranked internationally, and everybody knows this is a problem, okay? But there are enough Gilmans and Boys Latins in Israel to provide a small but very talented cadre of graduates with the skills to participate in the new global economy. And this cadre has led the charge in the creation of the Silicon Wadi, which has led to Israel attracting a lot of foreign investment in high-tech startups. Okay? So in other words, you do have some, let's put it this way, there are some schools in Baltimore that work, not many, but there are some that work. And if you siphon off the smarties over there, you can do something. Now, really, 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 the right way to do it is to make all the schools better. But until that happens, we're going to go with the small operation. Okay. In other words, it wasn't Israel that fundamentally changed. The schools are still the schools. The colleges and universities are still what they are. High tech is an area with unlimited growth, and therefore unlimited employment. Okay. In other words, it's an open new industry, and the sky's the limit, at least so far. Okay. So there's, there's like an unlimited number of jobs, but you got to have the skills to participate in that. It's not janitorial skills. You see, that's the problem. So there is today much room for economic expansion if they can recruit a larger workforce. That's why you hear all these, you read all these programs in the Frum magazines about the Haredi things. The government will do anything, even to get the women in, and B'nai Brak, all the rest of it, because they need people in these high-tech sectors, male and female, and get them in the workforce. That's the idea. I think you see this all the time in the press, don't you? Now, so a small group of skilled entrepreneurs jumped into the new dot-com phenomenon, assembling the brainiacs and giving them a free rein to invent and innovate in the areas of computers and chips and online and all that stuff that I do not understand, but whose benefits I use every day. Right? Because it was new, it wasn't as subject to government regulations as the older industries and economic models had been. This is a basic feature of our times, with a lot of bad connected to it, along with a lot of good, which is, you and I, most of us here, beyond a certain age, grew up in a pretty regulated America, whether you realized it or not, okay? Whether you realized it or not. And it was regulated in terms of the economy and regulated in terms of the culture and things of that nature. And we Jews benefited from that in the following way. I've made this point before. When I was a kid, and when some of you were kids, there were 3 TV stations, and that's all. There was nothing else. There was CBS, NBC, ABC. That's all there was. The other stuff came later. Guess what? None of those stations had anti-Semitism on them, for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, they're owned by Jews. But second of all, which is true, right? Well, but wait a second. But even if they weren't, you lose your license. You get it? There was nothing anti-black either. There was no racism on one of those shows, right? Not conscious, anyway. You lose your license. Same thing if you got a radio show. You lose your license. There's a regulated economy. Now you say, oh, regulation is terrible, all the rest of it. There are social benefits to having a regulation. If somebody wanted to launch some Nazi business, it had no venue, right? Does anybody remember George Lincoln Rockwell, from... No, nobody knows, because there was an American Nazi Party, and they couldn't get their message out. You see? Then came the 90s and afterwards, and the new economy, which was not regulated by Congress. You see? There was no Roosevelt in the 1990s to say that the internet and all this other stuff got to be regulated. And by that time, the culture wars had developed such a point that there wasn't a consensus for it, because they said, you're going to have left-wing liberals controlling in a what's the right word, woke way, anything that people say. And that's unfortunate, because that meant that nobody saw any room for any kind of control whatsoever. So you have no control, so the Nazis can now get their message out. So you and I, unfortunately, live in America, which anti-Semitism is growing all the time, fueled by this online junk, okay? That's what pushes it. If anybody wants to, just at a drop of a button, you can see the worst things all about the Jews. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not. You say whatever you want. There's no regulation. So there's a plus and a minus to the regulation kind of economies. But nevertheless, in Israel, as far as the actual economy is concerned, it wasn't the new stuff. Wasn't as subject to government regulation as the older industries and other models had been. So these new industries, these new businesses could rise and fall on a free market basis with the Darwinian results of survival of the fittest, right? Either you made it or you didn't make it. I'm sure a lot of companies went under. That's called a free market. And the other ones tightened up their act and did whatever they need to do, and they didn't go under. In addition to that, you had the extra unexpected phenomena of the Soviet Aliyah. A lot of these Ruskies came in with math and science skills. That's one thing the Russians did right. And by the way, if you were Jewish in Soviet Union, you had to get better grades. You know that. There was always that impetus. You have to get the A, because otherwise, they'll fail you or something like that. You see, and you definitely won't get a job unless you like a gold medal or something like that in your studies. Meaning, in order to be even with the other workers, you had to do better than them. So all I'm trying to say is that made you, that the people coming over into Israel included a lot of people with some serious math and science skills. In other words, not all the Ruskies ended up with professors who are now cab drivers. Plenty of them didn't. The huge potential profits in the dot-com attracted the most ambitious of the Russians, and still does. Bennett, as you know, and by the way, this is out of date. I put this in, sent it to Howard on Tuesday. Bennett made $100 million selling one business, and then he made $145 million selling another. Okay? So, I'm not, let's put it this way, he's not crying that he's not prime minister anymore. He has what to fall back on. Okay? But wait a minute. He made it. Right? In other words, he rode this wave. I can't take it away from him. You understand? He rode the wave. So he's just a symbol of what I'm talking about. Now, think what I just said. An Israeli guy can make $200 million. When did that happen in Ben Gurion and Eshkol and Golda Meir and all the rest of it? Right? By the way, they would have been horrified that a Jew would make $100 million. You see, that's like it's an avera to them. You understand? Which is ridiculous. Okay? And anyway, not in this world today. Okay? So my point is that there was no overhaul of the Israeli economy or educational systems. They simply added to it, on top of it, a lucrative high-tech dot-com sector, which became the most important sector. Wider reform is still a desideratum. So, when the parties run every once in a while, they promise this and that and the other. One of the things they always promise to do is fix up the school system, the public school system. They try to fix up other areas of the economy. It can be done, but it's not easy. That's all I'm trying to say. Now, an essential component of all this was an honest and incorruptible oversight system. Okay? You have to have, like in this country, an SEC or something like that. You have in Israel, you have to have Ministry of Finance, a Bank of Israel. You have honest reporting, observance of the laws. Because if you don't have this, then nobody wants to invest. Okay? I'm sending my money over here. The money's lost. I have nobody to talk to. Then that's the last time I'm going to go in there. That's the difference between a first world economy, first world country, and the others. Now, as I said, seriously, go invest in one of these third world countries and think it's like this. What happened to my money? How are you going to recover it in Sudan, in Syria, in Iraq, and all these places? Kiss it goodbye. Now, as I said, from a strictly antiseptic economic point of view, the experts should run the economy in terms of budget, balancing, as well as monetary policy and all that. The kind of people in this country they call Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, once upon a time long ago when the economy was working. But in the real world, there are pressures out there, political, social, and ideological. Yitzhak Rabin was not an economist, but he was an idealistic Israeli socialist in the best sense of the term. So even though they had this inflation and all the other stuff that I talked about at the beginning, something happened during Yitzhak Rabin's term, which I bet you nobody here probably knows except Israelis, and that is, well, you'll see in a second, the Labor Party did not run just on a foreign policy platform, and Kal V'chomer, the Meretz Party, didn't run just on a foreign policy platform, but they wanted to improve life here. When Meretz and Labor came to power, a major item was health care reform. The same thing you had in this country, right? With Hillary, with Obama, with Teddy Kennedy back before, they want to do universal health care, which they didn't have in Israel. Now, universal health care costs a fortune. It's arm and a leg, okay? But the old system of the Israeli Blue Cross and Blue Shield was in crisis. And so here you are in the 90s, in the midst of everything else, you can tell me like this, but how can they do that if the Oslo negotiations are going on? Life doesn't work that way. You understand? That's by the guys at the top. But the country has its own needs. And Chaim Ramon was the Minister of Health at that time, Israeli politician, and he pushed for Obamacare. That's what he did, okay? And he had a whole fight with the Treasury Department because they said this costs too much money, just like happened in any other country, including the United States of America. And at one point he resigned in the middle of the Knesset very dramatically. He said this government is a lie and so on and so forth. In the end, the law was passed, and damn the consequences. And ever since then, Israel's had Obamacare. I mean, I want you to see this. Israel has a system today. Israel has a universal system of health care set forth by the 1995 law. Oh, so that's Rabin, okay? The state is responsible for providing health services to all residents of the country who can register with one of the 4 national health service funds. So that's like Obamacare, right? No, they wasn't with the government, but it's under the government's close control. To be eligible, a citizen has to pay health insurance tax. Coverage includes medical diagnosis and treatment, preventative medicine, hospitalization, general maternity, psychiatric, chronic, surgery and transplants, preventive dental care for children, first aid, transportation to hospital and clinic, medical services at the workplace, treatment for drug abuse and alcoholism, medical equipment and appliances, obstetrics and fertility, medication, treatment of chronic diseases, paramedical, physiotherapy, and occupational therapy. It sounds like quite a coverage to me, okay? And you do it for the one-time tax that you pay, okay? So they really introduced the kind of Obamacare in Israel, which actually, when you get down to it, is a major landmark in Israeli social legislation. Right? So I think many people are familiar with the fact that in the Rabin years they signed the Oslo Agreement, but not so many are familiar with the Obamacare that they put in. Now, it's very expensive. The only way to meet the expenses is to grow the economy, which is exactly what Clinton and Trump were trying to do. Clinton in the 90s and Trump in the other time, they promised that they would grow the economy, which they did to some degree, but not enough to pay for the extra expenses. Okay, because in nowadays you can't cut social benefits. The people will riot. That's what we see. It's not a good thing, but it's the way it goes. You can't get any kind of. It's not realistic to go cold turkey or something like this in the United States of America or most of these Western countries, because all hell will break loose. You see? So that's the reality of it. There was a problem in the short run because there were massive immigrants of Russians coming in who are too expensive to provide for and are not going to be productive in the short term. This is where the high tech and .com saved Israel's economic bacon because it provided, number one, a magnet for foreign investment. Foreign investment means the government of Israel doesn't have to pay for this country, for this company. And number two, it provided a revenue stream in terms of exports, especially now that Israel's international image was much improved because of Oslo. So soon everybody's buying Israeli high tech. That starts really in the 80s, but in the 90s. It used to be in the area of weapons only. Then it spread to other areas as well. Maybe they're buying too much Israeli high tech, as in the case of China, which has freaked out the Clinton administration. Do you remember this? Right? The Chinese are buying everything, and it's going to be detrimental to the United States' interests. I remember Rabin didn't get it at first until Clinton called him in and said, this is how it goes, and he had to backtrack, and it still does. So as you see in this picture, this has been a problem running across U.S.-Israel relations under Clinton, under Bush Jr., under Obama, under Trump, and under Biden. It's currently in the news who said beware of China. And from the United States point of view, it's true. You understand? What's the good of Israel giving China some fancy technology if that'll hurt America? I mean, in the military sense. God forbid such a thing like this should happen. And indeed, I think today, I believe China bought Tenuva, and I think they bought the Haifa Harbor. If you look this up, you'll see. Notice it's more than you imagine. China's like heavily invested in Israel. Ad kedei kach that they're buying up whole chunks of the economy, which is not a great thing. Now, I don't want to go into that in detail, but there's security questions that connected with the Haifa Harbor business and all the rest of it. So the Chinese are not doing it because they're like Harry S. Truman, like Israel. They're doing it for cold, hard reasons. And on the other hand, I guess you say like this, it's better to deal with the problem of too much foreign investment than not enough. But it's tricky how these things go. Because if you alienate America, let's put it this way, there's enough anti-Israel sentiment, anti-Semitism in the United States today, somebody will start going on the internet and saying Israel is screwing America up with China or something like that. Chas v'chalila, that could really blow into something. Now, What gave Israel this jump start into high tech? As far as I know, it was the brainiacs who worked in Israel's Bletchley Park. You'll recall that in World War II, they got all the smart math and science people together to crack the German code. Remember that? The Enigma? Well, you'll see that's correct. So the same thing happened in a certain way in Israel. So here you have a case where the army or the government or the defense industry has a certain effect, as it always does on the economy. Okay? I think, I'm not working for the government or anything like this, but they always say the CIA and the NSA has technology 10 years ahead of everybody else. That's what they tell me. But 10 years later, it catches up to us. Something like that. So somebody's in that high-tech area over there. Now, stern necessity forced Israel to develop high-tech, like Faduda capabilities in its war against the Arab states and against Hamas and the other terrorist organizations. I mean, the ability, like you see in these movies, where they have spy things and heavy surveillance capabilities. They really do have these things. It costs a fortune. You have to develop them. Now, pretty soon next week, Bill will take over on this. Already in high school, but it's interesting. The Israeli system has developed in the following way. Already in high school, the IDF nurtures and siphons off the scientific brainiacs for Unit 8200. Okay? Look at this. It's kind of interesting. This is the new Israel. This is their NSA, their National Security Agency. So I just got this off the internet, that's all. Unit 8200, Yechida Shmona Matayim, okay, is an Israeli intelligence corps unit of the IDF responsible for signal intelligence and code decryption. You know what that means, right? Now, military publications include references to this unit as the Central Collection Unit of the Intelligence Corps, and sometimes it's called by this name. It's subordinate to that and that. This is composed mostly of kids 18 to 21 years old. That's my point. The security of Israel and all this high-tech business are draftees, 18 to 21. Isn't that something? As a result of the use of the soldier unit and the shortness of the service period, the unit relies on selecting recruits with the ability for rapid adaptation and speedy learning, after-school programs for 16, 18 years old, teaching them computer coding and hacking skills, also serve as feeder programs for the unit. Is this what I mean? The Army siphons off the brainiacs. They say, who in TA is good at math? There'll be one kid, or a girl, Beis Yaakov. I've met, maybe you have, maybe you have relatives. I've met a frum girl, modern, and she was like a very important person. She can't talk about it, and she was talking in Staten Island about this kind of stuff at the cutting edge. Yeah, that's different. That's a different kind. She doesn't have those skills. That's a different thing. After school programs, former Unit 8200s, after completing the military, well, you're only 21 years old, you're 22, okay? Going on to founding and occupying the top positions in Silicon Valley. You see how it goes? So in other words, the military system in Israel requires these kind of brainiacs, but your required service, as you know, you're only drafted for 3 years, right? And so you get this very heavy, intensive training in this, and now you're 22. You don't need to go to MIT, do you? You see my point? According to the director of the military at the Royal Institute in London, the British say that this is the foremost technical intelligence agency in the world and stands on a par with the NSA in everything except scale. I have no idea if that's true or not, but they're high up there. That's the point. They're high up there. This was established in 1952, in Ben-Gurion's time, using primitive surplus American military equipment. It used to be called Sunny Surplus, Okay. Originally, it was called the Second Intelligence Unit. Let's go to the next page. And such, and then it moved here and there. And look at this. According to this we just saw, they are highly focused on what they look at, certainly more focused than the NSA, and they conduct their operations with great tenacity and passion you don't find anywhere else, because they're looking at the Arabs. They're looking at their enemies. That's the point. I mean, the NSA goes all over the world for everything. I don't think Israel's spying going to Haiti or something like that. But the U.S. has to, right? They got the whole world. It's the largest unit, 82 is the largest unit in the IDF, comprising several thousand soldiers. It's comparable in function to the National Security Agency, a military defense body, just as the NSA is part of the U.S. Department of Defense. Subordinate to this is the unit this, Hatsav, whatever that is, Hatsav, responsible for collecting, what is this? What is it? Open source, yeah, that's it. Open source intelligence, you know what that means, right? You read the papers. The unit monitors and collects military intelligence from TV, radio, newspapers, internet, the translation of various items like basic intelligence. Notice they have a whole community. Let's go to the next one. And the most important part is this thing over here, Urim, okay? And it's the Negev Desert, 30 miles from Beersheba. And the Commission to Investigate Intelligence Network recommended turning the unit into a civilian agency, but this was not implemented. It's still under the Army. It's staffed by 18 to 21-year-old conscripts. Selection and recruitment is at the age of 18 through a screening process after high school. However, the unit also scouts potential younger recruits after school computer classes. These after-school classes teaching these kids coding and hacking skills are the feeder programs, as I told you before. The 18-year-olds selected are chosen for their ability to teach themselves and to learn very quickly because the unit only have access to their service for a short time, 2-3 years, whatever. And the Le Monde said that they operate a large base in the Negev, one of the largest listening bases in the world, capable of monitoring phone calls, emails, other communication in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So if you ever write to your cousin in Israel, they're listening. Just watch out, 8200 also maintains listening posts overseas, taps undersea cables, covert listening in the territories, has Gulfstream chats and all this kind of business. It's a constant operation, as you see over here. So you get my point. And the idea goes like this. When you get out of school, we can take that down. When you get out of school, you'll see in a minute. When you get out of school, you, so to speak, have a job or a department of the economy in which you can jump in. And if you're lucky, you'll do a business and sell for $100 million. That kind of business. So wait a minute. I just want to make this point before I show you the AV. They're not fixing the society. They're not transforming science education all across Israel. They're picking the smart kid in TA, the 2 girls in Beis Yaakov, the 1 kid over here, the 1 kid over here. And if you go countrywide, that's enough. You understand? Now, they would like, I guess, to expand this. This is why they're always interested in the Haredim. You understand? Because the kids have the smarts, they just have no skills. If it was up to them, this is not going to happen, especially now. If it was up to them, they would say, who are the smartest kids in the yeshiva that can think outside the box? Who pulled the coolest shtick? Who came up with the most creative thing, for blowing up the Rebbe's car or something like that? No. That's who they want. But then they say, I guess, but let us have him for a year training, this kind of business, and then he'll be in there. I think I told you the story. This is a little bit off the thing. In 1981, when they had, or it was 82, when they had the Lebanon War. And if you remember, there was one point where the Syrians launched a whole bunch of aircraft at Israel, and they shot down like 80 of them in one afternoon. Now, Israel shot down the Syrians, and which was a freak out, for the Russians. And it's called Operation Grasshopper or something like that. And it turned out that there was a guy in the Israeli Air Force headquarters in the Bor in Tel Aviv who just knew how to do something with a joystick based on computer stuff, and he was responsible for shooting down these planes. You get it? Because they did it based on a logarithm or something like that. It's beyond my knowledge. And he was a frum guy. I don't know how it worked, but he was a Haredi type guy in a kollel somewhere who they got to run this kind of thing. And he did it because the guy wrote about it, so I guess he really stood out in his black clothes and everything, in the Defense Department, but they used him. And afterwards, when it was over, he got out of the thing and he took the bus back to Bnei Brak. And this is during the Lebanon War. And when he got on the bus, a lady in Tel Aviv started screaming at him, "You're a parasite. You do nothing. You do nothing to defend the country. You understand? You should be ashamed of yourself." And he said like this, "I do defend the country. I learn Torah every day." So, so something like that may be going on at this time as far as we know. I don't know. But this has been like out of left field, out of right field, an extra shot into the economy. And I even found there's a lot of these. I just picked one online. You can see now all these videos in which these international type corporations to try to figure out how does Israel lead the world in these cyber security and cyber attack types of things, which they do, which are absolutely necessary against Iran and Russia and who knows what every day. So this is not a Jewish show over here. Take a look at this. HBO.
We've come to an underground car park just outside Tel Aviv to meet someone who's going to show us how easy it is to launch a cyber attack on almost any modern car.
Just like any connected computer, everything that you connect to the internet is vulnerable at the end. So this is true the same way to cars.
Ziv is using a wireless adapter that enables internet access to hack into the car's Wi-Fi, which is now standard on new vehicles.
What's weird about this little experiment we're doing is that I've got no idea what it is that he's going to be trying us.
So we're gonna start small, playing a bit with our windows.
So he's putting the windows up and down.
Let's play a bit with our blinkers.
So the left indicator's coming on, the right indicator's coming on. So now he's messing with the miles an hour thing. It's going all the way up to 220 kilometers an hour. The revometer's going all over the place. This would freak you out if you didn't know it was being done on purpose. Now it's completely disabled, engine malfunction. The fact that he can do all of this means that he could very easily just ram us straight into that wall in front of us. That experience and the experiment that we just did then is probably the first time where I've thought hacking could physically cause harm to me. How many cars in the world do you think you could do the same thing to right now?
Today, I would say that most of them are vulnerable or susceptible to hackers' attacks.
Though there aren't any cars made in Israel, the world's top auto security companies are Israeli. And they're all part of a wave of cyber innovation that's sweeping across the country.
Israel's become a world leader in cyber technology, and all of the Israeli companies who are at the forefront of that revolution are inside this building. There are over 10,000 people here from all over the world, and what many of them have come here to hear is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, laying out why this country is a global leader in the field.
A few years ago, I set the goal for Israel of becoming one of the top 5 cybersecurity powers in the world. It's a goal we have met. Today, Israel receives roughly 1/5 of the world's global private investment in cybersecurity. You're in a wonderful business. It's endless.
In fact, Israel receives more venture capital funds per person than any other country in the world and has become known as the startup nation. To understand how Israel became a global leader in this field, we spoke with Israeli journalist and senior defense correspondent Alon Ben David.
As a very small community that is practically an island, you're completely surrounded with nations that you cannot cross to. Israel developed creativity to compensate for its lack of resources, and it is a country that needs to conduct constant surveillance on the neighbors, as a country which is under a constant annihilation threat by other nations. Israel understood many years ago that going into wars and launching massive military operations, it bears almost unbearable prices. First in human lives, in terms of economic costs, in terms of international legitimacy. So cyber was the right answer for many things that Israel needed to do.
Do you think Israel's private cyber security industry is essentially the child of the Israeli military's affairs?
Oh, absolutely. The whole of the Israeli cyber industry relies on knowledge gathered by people serving in Israel's different security agencies and the military.
Military service is mandatory for most Israeli citizens, and one of the largest parts of the Israeli Defense Force is its cyber and intelligence units. These entire units, and some 20,000 cyber soldiers, are now being relocated to Beersheba, a desert city which is quickly becoming Israel's Silicon Valley. This military-industrial cyber complex is said to be the largest infrastructure project in Israel's history. We spoke with the CEO behind this $5 billion undertaking, Ronnie Zahavi.
What's the significance of the military being a part of all of this?
Because going to the service is compulsory, you can look at the Israeli army as the largest HR organization in the world. Because practically speaking, they start scanning the layers of the Israeli population and position the right people in the right places, especially in elite units. So if you think about it, you take somebody who is 18 years of age and you get them exposed to the state-of-the-art technology, to the highly advanced paradigms and methodologies. So when they go out of the service at the age of 23, 24, from an IBM point of view, or from EMC point of view, or from Intel point of view, somebody has already conducted the screening and already selected the best they can get in that sense.
But the initial screening and recruitment process for the IDF's most elite cyber units actually begins much earlier. In 2013, the Ministry of Defense helped create a national program for high school students interested in learning more about the realm of cyber. These after-school classes have become unofficial feeder programs for the IDF cyber units. We met with a recruiter for one of those units, C4I. We could not reveal her identity because of a security clearance.
מועמד אידיאלי, מישהו שאני מחפשת, בן נוער, בת נוער, עם קוגניציה ברמה גבוהה משאר בני הנוער שיש במדינה. ילדים שהאופי שלהם מספיק חזק בשביל להתמודד עם אתגרים טכנולוגיים במימד הסייבר, וככה אנחנו מניחים את ידינו לטובים ביותר ומביאים אותם למיון.
Yeah, so you get the idea. You can look these things up yourself. Let me make a few more points. A generation ago, veterans of the IDF didn't go into this. They went into being bodyguards for third world dictators, right? Because they monetized their skills that they picked up in the army in that era, okay? I'm not saying that's over, but that was there. Today it's high tech. All this started in the years of Rabin, but slowly, because Rabin did not dismantle and didn't want to dismantle the big Mapai industries, the kibbutzim, which still required subsidies, and same thing with Peretz. Culture and sentiment dominate. Dismantling and privatization didn't happen until a decade later under Bibi, who actually had a BA from MIT. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. The point I want to leave you with is this. Israel has succeeded in developing a niche sector, which is a big moneymaker, but it has not succeeded in creating a society-wide 21st century employment sector. Instead, the small niche pulls a large population. The government has not yet figured out how to adjust the 21st century schooling, and that's true in America also. We still have the old college model, all the rest of it. It's not so whatever. I just want it to last for another few years. Corona may have spurred us to start to rethink about school and college, and maybe about shul also. That's enough for one night. Let's say call it good night.